All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for making the long walk across the entire convention center to join us here this afternoon. If there's a spare chair by, feel free to kick your feet up. In any case, my name is Carrie Alexion-Tiernan. I'm a Director of Product Marketing in the Windows Azure team. And with me today, I have Venkat from my team, who is a Senior Product Marketing Manager. And we're going to take you through the various ways that you can take advantage of Windows Azure in your enterprise. We're going to talk a little bit about the different scenarios that you can use it for. We're going to show you a couple of demos and how you can actually get going with it and how quickly you can get up and running. So I'm going to ask you to hold any questions till the end. We'll have plenty of time for questions, so feel free to be interactive when we get there. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing that we just want to level set the room on is in terms of why customers are even considering the cloud. We talk to many different customers of all different sizes around the globe throughout the product development lifecycle. And even as we bring new capabilities to market, we're still talking to customers like yourselves. There are three key reasons why folks are really looking at taking advantage of cloud as part of their future data center strategy. And these are speed, scale, and economics. And the first one, around speed, comes really in two different capacities. One is the speed in which they set the infrastructure up that they're going to run their applications on. And the second is actually the speed at which they can develop those applications. So today, typically when a developer will go in and develop an application, they may have to look around them to find out which hardware is available so that they can build the application. When they get into load testing, they may or may not have the actual infrastructure that they will run on in production. So that can cause some challenges in terms of their ability to get the application into market and make it available quickly. So speed is one of the areas that customers are definitely taking advantage of the cloud for. Scale is another area, and this kind of ties into speed. If you can get your application and your infrastructure deployed quickly, then your ability to scale happens much faster as well. And when we talk about scale, there's a couple different things here. We could talk about scale in terms of global scale, meaning that you can take your application from your local geography to around the world in a matter of minutes. We also talk about scale in terms of capacity and resources. So you can scale resources up quickly and scale resources down quickly depending on the demand that you may be seeing. And that demand may be the load of a number of users running against that new application or that new infrastructure. That load may also be in reporting in batch jobs that you're running. So the ability to scale both globally and bring your application out very quickly, as well as the ability to scale those resources based on the demand that you're seeing or the decline in demand that you're seeing. And then the third area is really around economics. There are various components of the cloud that allow you to benefit from the economics associated with cloud computing. Some simple models are pay-as-you-go. So when you look at pay-as-you-go, you're only paying for the resources that you use when you use them. And this morning, if you guys saw the keynote, Brad and Scott talked a bit about the per-minute billing that we just changed to on our virtual machine. So when you think about the economics and pay only for what you use, in that particular case, you're only paying for the minutes that the VM is running. That also applies to the web and worker roles. But also from an economic standpoint, we have the ability to go ahead and take advantage of the cost differential when you think about storage, for example. Using storage in the cloud is much less expensive than going out and purchasing a big SAN or a NAS type device. So there are varying degrees of economics, and we want to ensure that you can take advantage of all of those as you think about how you're going to leverage cloud in your future strategy. Whoops, went the wrong way. Before we jump into the next piece, how many of you are actually using cloud, just so I can get a sense? So a fairly decent amount of you. How many of you have played with Azure? Even more. That's great. And then I'll ask the question, how many of you are running on AWS? All right. Thank you for sharing that. It just gives us an idea of sort of where everybody is at, so appreciate that. So as we look at all of these great benefits that are available to us in terms of speed, scale, and economics, we also recognize that there are challenges that you as IT and developers have to think about when you consider cloud in the strategy. And one of those things is, how do I integrate my existing investments, right? Because certainly you're not all greenfield, you're not all startups, and you're not all, in an environment where there are no servers available to you, so you can just go and leverage the cloud by default. Many of you have existing investments in your environment, and you've purchased servers, you've deployed servers, you may have SAN technology in there, you may have existing backup solutions. So how do you continue to take advantage of the investments that you have while also capitalizing on all of the benefits that cloud can bring you for the future and enable your business to move forward at a pace that they've never seen before? In addition, most of you have a heterogeneous landscape. Now, we know that Windows Server is deployed in approximately 2/3 of the market that's out there today. So we know that the share is high, but we also recognize that in some cases there is Linux running in the environments as well. So not only do we think about the heterogeneity from the operating system perspective, but also there are different languages that your developers are working with today, more so than they have in the past. So how do you ensure that as you think about this future strategy, you accommodate the heterogeneous landscape that you have in your environment as well? And then the last key area is really around security. So when we look at security and when we have conversations with you, by far this is the one that comes up the most. And that's because you've got very good at tuning your own environments and locking things down, as well as being able to respond and react quickly in the event that there is an attack, whether it's a virus attack, whether it's malware, whether it's a hack or denial of service. You've gotten good at that. So you want to make sure that any provider that you go to is also thinking with these principles in mind. And then from a compliance perspective, in some industries, there are certain requirements that you have with how data is handled, where information is stored, where the resources reside. So these are all things that in the environment that you have today, you have a little bit more control and flexibility on because they're within your four walls or within your data centers, so to speak. So we need to think about these things as we go forward. So as we kind of bring that down into the three key areas, what we hear often is that enterprise really needs integration, heterogeneity, and security. And we're going to talk about some of the key things that Microsoft provides in these areas. The first one is around integration. And when we look at the cloud computing and the benefits that it can bring into your strategy, we really look at this as an and proposition. It's on-premise, everything that you have in your environment today, and the cloud. We fully expect that over time you may migrate more to the cloud, but right now the proposition is going to be and. So you're going to take everything that you have today and you're going to look at what are the things that make sense to keep running on my existing environment, what are the resources that make sense to keep in-house, and then where can I capitalize on the benefits that we talked about in terms of speed, scale, and economics to move my business forward and integrate it with the cloud. When we look at this from a Microsoft perspective, you've probably heard us talk about the Cloud OS. What this is one consistent platform built on Windows Server 2012. So if you look at the three areas in the cloud, we have the Microsoft Cloud, which is Windows Azure. We have service providers, which some of you are leveraging third-party hosters or third-party outsources to run your data centers and help you with that IT management. And then we have the on-premise environment, which is the things that are within your data centers today. The underlying construct of all those, when it's Windows Server 2012, gives you great flexibility in how you want to strategize going forward. Because they are all running Windows Server 2012 and thus Hyper-V, you get the same VHD format that will move across all of these different locations, regardless of which one you choose. So that's where we start to look at the virtualization piece on the top of this diagram. But in addition to the virtualization piece, there are other areas where we're also making very heavy investments to ensure that you're synergistic and integrated across that hybrid and environment. Another one of those areas is identity. So if you think about what you have on-premise today, I suspect that most of you are using Windows Server Active Directory. In fact, 95% of the organizations around the globe are using Windows Server Active Directory. So we're taking that and ensuring that you can also integrate that through DirSync and other capabilities in ADFS up into the Windows Azure Active Directory. So now you have a single identity, regardless of whether you're accessing applications or resources that are on-premise, or you're connecting up to cloud applications from either Microsoft or third-party providers. So really looking at the combinations there. And then the last one I'll talk about is the data platform. If you look at what we've done with SQL, you have many SQL databases on-premise in your environment today, but we also give you the option to bring those databases into Azure. And you can do that through virtual machines running in Azure Infrastructure Services, or you can take advantage of our platform service, which is SQLDB, all based on the same code base. So there's a number of things that we're doing here to make sure that the integration piece for you is an and. We want to make sure that you can take advantage of the existing skill sets that you have while also take advantage of the benefits that the cloud provides, enabling you as the IT pro to take your business forward. From a heterogeneity perspective, I talked a little bit in the previous slides about Windows and Linux being the two operating systems in terms of heterogeneity. But when we look at what developers are doing today, it goes beyond just using a different operating system. They're also using different languages and frameworks. Most of the developers, are still running on .NET. There's a lot of Java in the enterprise, but we recognize that they're also using more open source frameworks such as Node.js and Python. In addition, many of you are probably familiar with the consumerization of IT trend. Now, being in the data center, that might not be hitting you as directly as some of your peers on the desktop side of the house, but I suspect that you're getting asked the question of how can the infrastructure support these devices, and how do we integrate our applications so that these devices can access the applications. In some cases, you may be looking at virtualization, you may be looking at VDI as a possible solution, or RDS. Those are all great solutions, and those are options that are available in the market today. As you think about your future and how you're going to code applications going forward, or how you're going to integrate these devices into your portfolio going forward, looking at the back-end platform and deciding if you should go cloud first on your application might be something that you consider for your future. So that way you don't have to put the extra infrastructure in place. So some things to consider there. But all of these things fall under the heterogeneity category, and really looking at the diversity that each one of you has in your environment, and then figuring out what is the right usage for me to get the most benefit. Now, the third area that we mentioned is around security and trustworthiness. And one of the things that we heard in a recent IDC survey is that 60% of the respondents, and these were typical large organizations all the way down to mid-market, but most of the organizations that responded in this survey indicated that they want to work with a provider that they trust. It's somebody that they've been working with for some time. It's somebody that they have a relationship with. It's somebody that they trust. So essentially, we want to share with you a little bit on the principles that we take in terms of cloud computing. And for those of you that have been working with our technology for quite some time, you know that we build our technology with security as a core principle. In some cases, we actually lock it down more than you guys like, but we build with that security in place. So the first area that we want to talk about is transparency. So we build trust through transparency, and whenever we can, we try and share as much information with you as possible. And what we're doing from a cloud perspective is we're ensuring that we integrate with a lot of the industry standards. And I've called out just one here in terms of the STAR compliance from a security perspective. But we are a member there. We do participate in those standards, and we help move the industry forward in terms of those. In addition, we have yearly audits. So we have outsiders come into our data centers and audit the way that we manage those data centers. That may be from a controls perspective in terms of how we're managing processes against making sure our uptime is in place. It may be in terms of configuration. But those are independently verified audits that we have come in on a yearly basis. The other thing that I want to call out is the monthly SLA. So some of the other vendors in the market, they will go to a yearly SLA. We've made a decision that we will track our availability on a monthly basis, and we'll ensure that anytime we have an SLA in place, that we financially back that SLA. So if for some reason a service that you're leveraging on the platform goes down for a period of time, we will ensure that we credit you for that downtime. So there are a number of things that we're doing here. And one of the other things I want to call out is the real-time status in terms of the service dashboard. So at any given time, we do have a website that's out there. It's a service dashboard for all of our services that are available. And you can see the red, yellow, green light in terms of what the status is. And if there's information that we can share, we generally post it on that site. And we also do root cause analysis on any outage that occurs, and then we communicate that information back to you. So we're working really hard to try and give you as much transparency as we can, because one of the things that changes when you decide to use a cloud infrastructure is that you can't walk into the data center anymore. And you can't, see that the drive may be down and that it's gone bad and you pull it and put another one in. So we want to make sure that we can give you as much information and make you as aware as possible in the event that something does happen. The other thing that we're looking at is simplicity and being able to access the resources, right? So as you guys look across everything that you're doing on the Microsoft platform and then other vendors, we want to make sure that's simple, right? So attach it to your existing EA. Don't go out and do the credit card thing. You can go ahead, attach it to your EA. The support comes in the same way that it does through your existing CSS and MCS contracts, and it's 24/7, 365. Now, in terms of experience, this is always an interesting sort of timeline, because people don't necessarily recognize that we've been in the online services business for quite some time. And if you look at where Azure sits on the timeline, it's actually one of the newest services that we've brought to market. But newest doesn't necessarily mean immature, right? Because if you take all of the experience that we have on all of those services, we've taken that learning and we've taken that and we've integrated it into how we manage our Azure data centers. So look at just some of the numbers that are going through these services. 9.9 billion messages, 600 million unique users, a petabyte of updates that go through the infrastructure. And our global foundation services are managing across all of these online services, as well as bringing all of that learning into the same infrastructure that's powering the cloud resources that you guys are running on Azure. So lots of experience there. And in the same fashion as what we've done with you over the last 20 years in terms of every time we release a new product, you guys come into the EBC and say, okay, so tell us what you learned, because we don't want to do that all by ourselves, right? Like, we don't want to make those same mistakes. We fully expect that we'll be able to share those learnings on how we've managed these online services, so that as you take that next step forward in your cloud strategy, we can share those learnings with you to help you move along on that cycle as well. So in summary, we really believe that Windows Azure delivers on the integration, heterogeneity, and security. And we're going to show you, actually, we've got 4 scenarios that we're going to take you through so that you can see how you can start to use these capabilities right out of the gate. Before we go there, though, there's often questions that we get asked about, the Wizard of Oz. Who's the guy behind the curtain? Who's making this all work? I connect to these services, and it's great that they're always available for me. They are always quick and responsive, but where do these resources actually reside? So let's take a look. We have 8 global data centers around the world that are currently up and running today. 4 that are in the US, 2 that are in Europe, and then 2 that are in Asia. We just announced a couple weeks ago, how many of you heard the announcements around the new data centers? Okay, so just a few of you. We just announced that we are going to put 2 additional data centers in Australia. We're going to put 2 additional data centers in Japan. And we are the first company to actually get data centers in mainland China. So if you think about your businesses and wanting to expand your businesses and your companies wanting to go into new markets, all of a sudden, your global reach, if you want to go with cloud computing, just went to the other side of the world in a matter of minutes. So pretty powerful capabilities there in terms of being able to leverage resources and data center compute power in a place where you might not have a data center, or you may never actually build a data center. So that's our global reach. I put in a couple pictures here because, I know you guys like to see all the bells and whistles and stuff like that. And I have a video behind it where we'll take just a little tour into what the data centers actually do and give you a sense for how we manage these. So the other thing that I want to point out is that from a global support perspective, we are everywhere. And I think, just based on the diversity of the room and the folks that we have in here, I suspect if I named off a couple countries, we'd see hands go up. Microsoft is a global company. We want to make sure that we have both global support and local account teams there for you at all times. And this is no different with Azure. Even though the cloud computing is spread across different geographies, we will ensure that you have the local support that you need. And we also have the local currencies for those of you that need to purchase in that format. So in terms of our overall system and support, when we look at our Global Foundation services, the guys and gals that support the infrastructure there, across our services, they're supporting over 1 billion customers and 20 million businesses. So really, really, really big scale here. And tons of experience based on the learning over the years. And the great thing about it is that they're willing to share it with you. And they're willing to help you guys get those skills as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just flip it into the video real quick. And we'll just take a minute or two to look at what it looks like inside of one of our global data centers. And what we see here is actually something that you could do as an individual who comes into our executive briefing center. So many of your leadership teams may have come into Redmond to our executive briefing center, and they meet with our executives. Sometimes myself and Venkat and others on my team will also present to them about Azure. But one of the benefits that they have is they can request a tour to one of our data centers. And we'll drive them out to the data center, and they can actually see how we do some of the stuff that you're going to see on the video right now. So let's go ahead and, as I just blew it up. Good job, Carrie. I'm going to start it a little bit in just so we...
Today, we're going to take you on a brief tour of a Microsoft data center and share how we ensure trustworthy and reliable cloud services while continuously improving performance, scalability, and efficiency. Microsoft operates a global array of data centers and edge compute nodes, all connected through a high-speed network. Our major data centers house tens of thousands of high-performance processing and storage servers in high-density racks. Chillers and air handling equipment ensure precise control over environmental conditions. Uninterruptible power supplies, or UPS systems, and vast banks of batteries help ensure power remains continuous in the event of a short-term disruption. Emergency generators provide backup power for extended outages and for planned maintenance, and can operate the data center with on-site fuel reserves in the event of a natural disaster. A high-speed, robust fiber optic network connects servers within the data center and connects each data center with other major hubs and internet users. Edge compute nodes host workloads closer to the end users to reduce latency and increase overall service resiliency. Microsoft ensures high availability through multiple layers of redundancy, advanced monitoring and incident response, and geo-redundant backup and graceful failover capability, all managed through our geographically distributed Microsoft Operations Centers operating 24/7, 365 days a year. We also deploy one of the largest implementations of Microsoft System Center in the world, and we use our own...
I'm going to cut it right there, but just to give you a quick overview, you saw some of the different capabilities and server racks and the power and the cooling and everything that we've built throughout those data centers. It's a fairly significant investment that we've made, and we continue to do more innovation in each one of those data centers. And I don't know, on the picture that I had earlier, there's one interesting one that we call a pod or a pack. And they are literally shipped to us by the vendors, and all of the racks are built inside of this container. And there's a door, and you literally walk into the container, and all of the lights just light up. So we've done some things that allow us to actually take the data center and shrink it down and make it super, super efficient in terms of our power and compute. So all of that is benefits that you guys get by running on the platform. So I want to close out here as I get ready to hand it over to Venkat and just share what are the key components associated with the platform. So we really break it out into three key areas, and the first one is infrastructure services. And if you take a look at what's listed under infrastructure services, these will be things that are very familiar to you. You're already running virtual machines in your environment. you likely have virtual networks and VPN set up. So we see a lot of customers start with the infrastructure services piece because it's something that they're familiar with. They know how to build applications on these things, and they also know how to manage them. At this particular layer, you guys as IT pros are doing the management against this infrastructure. We're not managing these VMs on your behalf. We'll manage the host underneath it, meaning the Azure platform infrastructure, but it's the responsibility of the company to manage the virtual machines and the networking and things of that nature. If we look at the next sort of area in data services, this is where most of our SQL database and HD Insight is used for looking at Hadoop data as well. And then we have our typical storage, blob storage, which is the back end for everything pretty much that you store on Windows Azure. As we go up into app services, these are more of our platform services. So these are services that Microsoft builds directly on the Azure platform that your developers can take advantage of and integrate them with the applications that they're building. In some cases, these services make it easier and faster for the developers to actually move their application through the cycle because there are pieces that they can integrate that they don't have to code on their own. So we look at that from a platform services perspective. Now, when we take advantage of each one of these capabilities, we don't necessarily have to use every particular part of the infrastructure. Depending on what you're trying to do with the application, you may take some components from app services, you may take some component from data services, and bring them together to create your application. And for those of you who are looking to really just move the infrastructure piece, you can do that also. And what we typically see is that customers will go ahead and they'll combine virtual machines, virtual networks, and then they'll also set up a VPN that goes from the Azure public cloud down into your data center. And we have the ability to do the VPN both on software and hardware. And one of the things that we shared this morning was that in addition to Cisco and Juniper that we already support on hardware devices, we also added in WatchGuard, F5, and Citrix VPN devices as well. So you can do that from a hardware and a software layer. And with that intro, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Venkat, and he's going to take you through a couple of scenarios that you can start using today, take advantage of Azure, and we'll show you some of those use cases as well.
Thanks, Gary. So before I begin, I want to ask a question. How many of you guys already have purchased a Surface or a Surface Pro? Okay, how many want to? Much bigger number. The reason I ask is because all my demos today are set up on my Surface Pro, so it's pretty awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. What I want to do in the next part of the session really is go over 4 scenarios, and these are very basic scenarios where enterprises are focused on when they use Windows Azure. Again, these, like I said, are easy scenarios for you folks to get started with. A lot of customers are doing really interesting and complicated things with Windows Azure, and these don't cover those, okay? But as we go through these, I will show you a couple of interesting things about the platform. We'll talk about some of the features, and at the end, if you still have questions, we're more than happy to answer them. So let me go and switch this over, because before I even go into the scenarios, I want to show our management portal, right? And several of you are already using Windows Azure already. Is anybody using two-factor authentication to log into Windows Azure today? Okay, nobody. So that'll make for a really good demo. So really, when you log into Windows Azure, there are 2 ways you can set up your account. One is using your Live ID, or what we call Microsoft account these days. And a second way is using your Office 365 ID, which is essentially an ID that is stored in Windows Azure Active Directory service. And if you want to use two-factor authentication, it's the second approach that supports it. So I'm going to go and show you guys that. I'm going to click here in the second option there. Takes me to a new screen. And what I had done prior to this is set up this account and enabled it for two-factor authentication. So essentially, two-factor authentication means that you have to have 2 factors, right? You have to have your password, and also you have to have some other factor with which you can be identified. In this case, what it's trying to do is it's trying to give me a call. So I get the call once I log in.
Using Microsoft Sign-In verification system.
So it's going to give me a nice little voicemail. And once I press the pound key here, what really happens is it basically signs me into the system, right? So for those folks of you who have compliance reasons and things like that, and you need to enable multi-factor authentication, this is an easy way to get set up with Windows Azure. Once you log in, of course, this screen is probably familiar with many of you guys. It's a neat HTML5 portal that you can control your Windows Azure. On the left-hand side here, you have all the different categories of services that Carrie mentioned earlier. And at the bottom part of the screen, in the ribbon here, is what I call the launcher, where you can essentially create new services or, in fact, perform actions on current services that you already have running. So with that, let me go back and we'll talk about some of the scenarios now. So as enterprises are looking at Azure and as enterprises are looking at cloud, these are some of the most common scenarios that we're coming up against more and more these days. First one is using cloud as a just for storage, backup, and recovery sort of scenarios. Second is for test and development scenarios. And third and fourth are basically ways to use the cloud where existing data center and infrastructure will not suffice your needs, right? And we'll go through each of them and understand about the features of the platform that enables you to do so. So let's talk about the first one first, storage, backup, and recovery. If you ask any organization today and ask about their data increase pattern, this is something like, this is what it looks like. On average, this is an IDC figure. Enterprises experience 50 to 60% growth in their data every single year. So essentially, it's an exponential blue line curve up there, right? Although data is growing at this rate, if you ask them how much of this data is actually being used frequently, it starts to look like that line, right? It is not as much. It's only a small portion of all of the data that enterprises have that you actually need to access on a frequent basis. So here's an idea. Why not use the local storage in your data center for the frequently accessed data and think about using the remaining for cloud? Why would you want to do that? Because it makes a lot of economic sense. Forrester had a figure out there which said that if you were to use cloud storage, it is going to be a quarter of the price as it would cost you if you had done the same thing on on-premises SAN storage. Does that mean every single data that you have is, you can put up in the cloud? Probably not. You probably have a lot of compliance reasons. You have, performance reasons that you cannot just put some data up in the cloud. But as you think about your data on premises, this is a neat way of, thinking about what can belong to what can be put in the cloud and what can remain on premises, right? So with that, let's talk a little bit about the Windows Azure storage system we have in place. This is basically, I think of the Windows Azure storage just like a big, giant hard drive up in the cloud, right? Just as the picture shows. And why is it a giant? Because it has 7 trillion objects today across the globe. On any given second, it's handling about 300,000 requests. And during peak times, we've seen it go up to almost 1 million requests per second, right? It's a giant, scalable, globally available storage system that we have. And recently, Nasuni, an independent third party, they basically measure the different cloud service providers for storage across things like availability, speed, tests, read-write tests, and so on. And basically, Windows Azure topped that ranking, right? So it's a really good storage to get started with. So here are a few neat things about the Windows Azure storage. It is, like I mentioned earlier, it's basically durable and scalable. And every single copy of data that you put in the Windows Azure storage, we make 3 copies of that within a certain region. What that means is if a certain rack were to go down or a storage server were to go down, your data is still is available, right? It still is there for you to access the data. And we also provide an SLA of 99.9%. Carrie mentioned earlier, it's all financially backed. And all of the APIs for the storage system are all REST-based APIs. So what that means is, you can write your own tools or use third-party tools that are built against those REST APIs. Not only do we make 3 copies of the data in a given region, what we also do is asynchronously, we make another extra 3 copies in a data center that's hundreds of miles away from the initial region where you copied the data into. What that means is your data, if you were to use Windows Azure Storage, is protected against regional disasters. We call this feature geo-replication, and we're the only vendor who's actually doing that. So automatically, when you're thinking of Windows Azure for your storage or DR purposes, you can make use of this feature to factor DR planning into your scenarios. So with that, what I wanted to quickly do is show you guys how you can set up a simple storage account in Windows Azure. Perhaps some of you folks have already seen that. And I will just copy a simple file into that storage system to just get, so we can see how easy and simple it is to get started with the storage system. So I'm going to switch back. So the first thing you want to do is, like I said earlier, on the left-hand side, you see all the different services, right? And to create anything new, obviously, you hit the new button at the bottom. You go into Data Services, hit Storage, and Quick Create. Couple of things it's going to ask you. It's going to ask you a URL by which you can address that storage account that you create. So I'm just going to choose something random here. Okay, it's going to ask me a location where that account gets created. So I'm going to choose West US. These are, by the way, the different data centers that Carrie mentioned earlier across the world that we have, the Windows Azure data centers, right? And there's a nice little option here to enable geo-replication. By default, that's automatically enabled. But for compliance reasons, if you don't want to make 2 extra copies in a region far away, you can disable that and get a nice discount as well. And that's it. Your storage account basically gets created. It's as simple as that. So while that is getting created, what I have done already is created a storage account earlier on called Venkat Storage. Once it gets created, you can take a look at a bunch of things that is available, right? I want to point your attention to containers, because this is a necessary step before you start using the storage account for copying files or whatever. Containers, essentially, think of them as simple folders in a drive, right? You need to create those folders before you can copy those files into. So we'll go ahead and create a container here. We'll call it financial data. The access, I'm going to keep it to private. Of course, if you want to give everybody access, you can do so by selecting the public container option. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So right now, it is creating that container in that storage account that we had created. So the other thing I want to mention now is this little icon here called Manage Access Keys. Now, these are the keys that are used to access the storage account that gets created. Let's go ahead and click that. There are 2 keys that are provided for each storage account, and these are the keys with which you can access that particular account, right? And the reason why we give 2 keys is that in case you want to regenerate a particular key, you can still access the account using the other key, so hence 2 keys. So now that we have set up a storage account, we've created a container in it, let's actually try and copy a file into this newly created container, all right? So in order to do that, what I'm going to use is a third-party tool called Cloudberry Explorer. It's free, so you can just download and use. It's built against the Windows Azure Storage REST APIs. First thing, what we need to do is associate the Azure account with this particular tool. If you remember earlier, I had provided a URL. Essentially, this is what the tool is asking me for the storage account. And then here is where I copy the key that you guys just saw. Okay, it's copied. Okay, so it's associated, right? The next thing is now I can go and take a look at that particular storage account. If you remember, we just created a container, and that container appears here, financial data, right? And then I can just copy a file into the container that I created. And boom, it's copied, right? So what really happened in the background is Windows Azure took that file, it made 3 copies of that file within a region, and asynchronously, eventually, it's going to make an extra 3 copies in a faraway region for disaster purposes, disaster recovery purposes, all right? So it's as simple as that, really, getting started with Windows Azure Storage. So switching back, I want to basically now talk about 3 different, more complicated solutions, obviously, than the simple thing that I showed, on how you can use Windows Azure storage through some first-party solutions that Microsoft provides. The first of which is called Store Simple. How many of you guys have heard of Store Simple here? Okay, so if you guys, and I see some hands up there, so essentially it's a nice, nifty solution which behaves like a SAN appliance that you drop it on your premises. And what it does is while it behaves like a SAN storage, it is integrated with Windows Azure Storage, and it is tiering data automatically. So for the data that is frequently accessed, it keeps on premises for performance reasons, obviously. And the data that is not so frequently accessed, it puts that up in Windows Azure. And because it uses iSCSI protocol, there is nothing really that is difficult about using this device on your premises. So it provides for a very simple and fast on-ramp to Windows Azure if you're thinking of using Windows Azure for storage backup or recovery purposes. And by doing so, there have been a lot of customers who've used this and have seen significant cost savings. We've seen in that range of 60 to 80% of cost savings compared to on-premises solutions. So this is one way of getting started with Windows Azure for backup and recovery. There is yet again another way in which you can start using Windows Azure storage, and that is basically to use the storage system for your SQL Server backups, right? If you have a SQL Server database running on premises, you can use SQL Server Management Studio, and you can put those database backups in Windows Azure. And the neat thing about putting those backups in Windows Azure is that if something were to go wrong with the on-premises database server, you can use the backups that were made in Windows Azure, and you can spin up VMs quickly and get your database up and running fairly quickly, right? So it not only provides for a backup, but it also provides for a disaster recovery or a business continuity solution for your database servers. So here's another example. Yet a third example is using this service called Windows Azure Backup. Now, Windows Azure Backup is a Windows Azure service that connects to Windows Server and System Center DPM for backing up your files and folders from Windows Server or backing up your entire data center data over to Windows Azure. So what I want to do now is quickly show you how to go ahead and get set up with Windows Azure Backup. So switching back, so first thing what you need to do in order to get set up with Windows Azure Backup is to create what we call a backup vault, right? That is the place where all your backup data is going and sitting. So you have to click on Recovery Services. It's a preview feature right now, so you need to sign up it's a one-time sign up initially, and then click Create. I'm going to create a name for my backup vault. And I can select a region where the backup vault gets created and create vault. Okay, so while that gets created, it's going to be fairly simple to create that backup vault. There are a few more steps that need to be done in order to set up a server to start using that backup vault that we just set up. So if you click on that, it actually outlines those steps that you need to take. First thing what you need to do is you need to upload a management certificate, which is basically a public key certificate. Second thing is you need to install an agent onto the Windows Server, which you want to back up to. And the third thing is you need to do some amount of configuration in order to point to the backup service. What are the various things you want to back up? What are the folders? What are the drives and so on that you want to back up? So what I will do is I have a server that is my Office server that is already set up with those things, and I want to take you there and show what are the features that it offers for backing up. So I'm going to log into a Windows server that is using Windows Azure Backup. So let's go ahead and close this. So on this particular server, prior to this session, what I've done is I've installed the agent, and I've set up the certificates. And once all of that is done, you can actually start scheduling backups. So this is the tool that is provided as a part of the installation of the agent. And once that is done, the first few steps that you need to take, which I've already done, is register the server. This is where it asks for your private key, PFX file, and so on and so forth. And once all of that is done, what you can do is you can start scheduling your backups. And once you go through this wizard, it's a very simple step-by-step process, and you can say, hey, in my D drive, I want to back up these many folders, and so on and so forth. It's very similar to what you would do with a normal backup tool that is provided in Windows Azure if you're doing it on premises, right? So it's very straightforward. All right. So this was the third way in which you can use Windows Azure storage system. So let's go forward and take a look at our second scenario, which is essentially using Windows Azure for test and development purposes. And it's fairly common because if you were to use on-premises environment for test and development, there are a bunch of limitations that you folks face, right? One is basically you have limited hardware budgets. And typically, this is how it works. Developers come and ask for virtual machines. The IT admin, sometimes if there's enough hardware lying around, it's provisioned for the developers. If not, then the IT admin has to go and procure them. Sometimes this whole cycle can take as much as weeks to months, we've seen in big enterprises. So that's a big limitation, obviously, to doing test and development work. The other limitation is you might be limited by the software licenses that you have, right? A fairly common limitation as well. And the third thing is, most often in big enterprises, test and development is not considered a tier 1 workload because your mission-critical LOB applications are the tier 1, have the tier 1 status. So test and dev tends to take, a second priority. So because of that, you basically end up compromising developer agility, right? So, and that's a big limitation as well. And the last thing is, when you are doing on-premises test and dev on-premises, you cannot really do a full-blown realistic scale test that might be required of an application. You might have a bunch of VMs, maybe 10 VMs for an application that you've set up. But let's say the application that the developer is developing requires 100 VMs to take to account for those peaks. There's no way you can do that on-premises, and the cloud again becomes a good place to do those kinds of testing. So essentially, when you start using Windows Azure for test and development, all those limitations basically go away, right? Because fundamentally, it's in the cloud. You can spin up VMs, you can use them, you can spin down, and you're only paying for what you use. And with this morning's announcement, there are a bunch of things that we've done to make that even more economical. First is we've introduced per minute billing. So we don't round off your usage to the nearest hour. If you use for, say, 23 minutes of a VM, you actually bill only for 23 minutes versus an entire hour. Second thing we announced is there are a bunch of new MSDN benefits. So if you are an MSDN subscriber, if your developers have MSDN subscriptions, you can use MSDN software now in Windows Azure, right? So that's a big advantage. And beyond that, we talked about the other advantages that you get with test and dev in Windows Azure. So with that, what I want to do is quickly show you guys the workflow of spinning up a new VM and show how simple it is in Windows Azure. And while we go through, I can explain some of the things that you'll see in the workflow. All right, I mean, again, I'm guessing many of you have already tried this. Hit compute from the new launcher underneath. Click on virtual machine, and then you can hit gallery. Gallery is essentially a set of images that we provide automatically for you to start your instances from. There is Windows Server 2012, there's 2008 R2, SQL Server, BizTalk, SharePoint, and a bunch of Linux distributions as well here. If you were to choose the Windows Server here, automatically, the license is baked into the price that you pay. So I'll go ahead and select Windows Server Data Center version here. It's going to ask me a bunch of things like the virtual machine name. And then it's going to ask me the size of the VM, right? And we have today all the way from extra small, which is 768 megabytes of memory, to 56 GB of memory for the very large instances, 8 cores and 56 GB. So those can be used for fairly, big applications if you're trying to run on a server. It's going to ask me the username. I'm going to enter my username and password. No, the DNS name is the publicly addressable DNS name. Every VM that is instantiated automatically gets one, and that has to be unique. So we'll see if Venkat123 is taken. That is not taken. Okay. So, and the storage account, I'm going to just leave Windows Azure to select the storage account, but you can actually select the storage account that you want your VM to store its disk in. Okay, region and affinity group, you can again select the different regions that Windows Azure provides. So I'm going to choose West US in this case, and click Next. It's asking me what's known as an availability set, which is essentially a construct in Windows Azure which allows for, if you want to have different VMs that are running and you want to place them across different fault domains, then you can basically choose availability set. Allows you to basically build applications that are highly available. So if there was a problem with a rack or a particular server, then you can still have VMs in an availability set and make sure your applications are highly available. Okay, so with that, essentially I click OK, and Windows Azure is going to start provisioning that server for you. It takes 2 to 5 minutes for the server to start running, and you can actually access that server. There is a server that I've already set up here. And by default, it opens a couple of endpoints, essentially for remote desktoping or PowerShelling. Earlier, if you realize in the wizard, it asked me, do you want to enable PowerShell? And I checked enabled. Once it's enabled, those 2 ports are open, essentially, right? And from here on, I can actually just connect to this particular server. Hit connect. It is going to download a .rdp file. And if I were to open, I can essentially start a session with that particular VM, right? It's that simple. And once, of course, you start a session, it's no different from a VM that's running in your data center, right? It's just running in Windows Azure, and you're paying it only for the amount of time that you use, and the license is baked into that particular pricing. So it's that simple. So, I mean, my objective really here was to show how simple and easy it is to set up virtual machines in Windows Azure for test and development scenarios. Now, fairly often, a question that comes up from customers is, great, I've used Windows Azure for test and development, but my production environment is, I don't want that to be in Windows Azure. I want that to be on premises, or I want that to be elsewhere, maybe a partner, right, a service provider. So the neat thing about Windows Azure is that the underlying virtualization layer that we have in Windows Azure is based on Hyper-V. So what that means is the format of the file of the VM is exactly the same as it is on Hyper-V. The VHD format just runs as if it would run on premises using Hyper-V, right? So the advantage of that is you can literally spin up VMs in Windows Azure, do your test and development, take those VHDs, and then run elsewhere, be it on premises or in some cases, your partners, third-party service providers. In fact, there was a customer called Telenor who did exactly that. They were faced with a rather unique scenario of upgrading, SharePoint 2007 to SharePoint. Okay, that's a typo there. There's no 2013. It's 2013. And really, the challenge for them was that they did not have enough, on-premises infrastructure to do this test and development. So they set up an entire SharePoint farm in Windows Azure, did all of that testing in a matter of days. And once all of the testing was done, they moved the entire SharePoint farm to their production environment, which was in this case a third-party provider. And in doing so, what they did is they basically enjoyed all of the benefits for that I mentioned all this while, right? Economics, easy to get started, as well as using familiar tools like PowerShell and Visual Studio to do the test and development. So hopefully, test and development scenario is something that you would consider using Windows Azure for if you haven't already done so. Third thing is, we call that extend your infrastructure. Essentially, this is a scenario where you might be running out of your data center capacity, computing resources in your data center. And, there are 2 things you can do then. Either buy new hardware and provision new hardware in your own data center, or use Windows Azure, right? So this is essentially that particular scenario. And the reason why you can use Windows Azure to extend your infrastructure is because of our few services which we call infrastructure services, right? I showed some of those earlier, the ability to spin up VMs in Windows Azure, persistent VMs. And a second feature that allows you to basically do extension of your existing data center is called virtual network, Windows Azure Virtual Network. And what that does is it essentially allows you to create an isolated container in Windows Azure environment, which is a public cloud environment, where you can bring your IP addresses, private IP addresses, you can bring your DNS settings, and inside that container, you can have your own subnets. And optionally, you can connect that container back to your on-premises using an IPsec tunnel, right, a VPN tunnel. So in this particular case, what you're seeing here is there is your on-premises on the left-hand side, and there is a site-to-site VPN connection between Windows Azure and your on-premises. Like Carrie mentioned earlier, we support today a bunch of hardware VPN gateways on-premises, Cisco, Juniper, WatchGuard, Citrix, F5 as well. And recently what we announced is you can also use Windows Server RAS mode in order to basically connect back to on-premises using site-to-site VPN. There's another new thing that we announced recently. It's called point-to-site VPN. And the two gentlemen up front sitting here are the folks in the engineering team who've made that happen. So what the point-to-site VPN does is it allows individual computers, whether it's my Microsoft Surface Pro here, or if it's an individual server running in your premises, to connect to the virtual network that you created in Windows Azure. And it sets up a VPN tunnel, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at how you can set that up and how you can actually connect a computer like mine to the virtual network in Windows Azure. And just so that you guys see what I'm trying to do here, what I'll try and do is I will first set up a VNet, a virtual network in Windows Azure with those IP addresses, the 10.10 address range, and then I'm going to create a gateway, and then I'm going to try and connect a PC to Windows Azure Virtual Network that gets created. What I will not show you guys is what's on the left-hand side, connecting and setting up a real VPN tunnel site-to-site connectivity between my office and the VNet here. Okay. Okay, so in order to basically set up a VNet, it's the standard steps that you guys might have already followed because this is not a new feature. This is we've had this for a year now. And the way you would do it is go to Networks, click on Virtual Network. In this case, I'm going to choose Custom Create, but there are a variety of ways in which you can create a virtual network. For example, importing from an XML file and so on. So I'm going to choose Custom Create. It's going to ask me the name of the virtual network that I'm trying to create. Choose a network, and as you can see, as I type and start configuring this network, in the network preview below, it shows it has a graphical representation of what I'm configuring. It's going to ask me an affinity group. Essentially, an affinity group is a construct, again, in Windows Azure, where you can place things in an affinity group, and they're all placed close together in the data center to minimize network latencies between the machines. So I'm going to choose the default one there. It's asking me the DNS server. Again, this is an optional thing. If you want to bring your own DNS, you can do so. If not, you can just let Windows Azure assign a DNS for you. So in this case, I've already created a DNS server earlier, which is a 10.1.0.4, which is my Office DNS. So I'm going to select that. And then I'm going to configure the point-to-site VPN as well as the site-to-site VPN. So what you can see below is, again, a graphical representation of that happening. So next, it's asking me for the point-to-site connectivity, which is essentially the clients that I'm trying to connect to that virtual network. What is the address range from which the addresses can be assigned, right? So I'm going to choose the default, which is a 10.0.0.0/24 address range. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And this is where it's asking me for the address space and how I want to splice it up into subnets in my virtual network. So I'm going to just leave it this way in the interest of time. It's a 10.0.1 network. That's my VNet up in Windows Azure. And I'm going to select OK. OK, there's a missing step that I missed here, which is basically creating a gateway for the gateway subnet. And the reason why it requires a subnet for the gateways is that it stands up by default 2 gateways. So in case something were to go wrong with one of the gateways for the VPN, the other one takes over, and you have high availability of the connection. So once I create the gateway subnet, it's completed. All right, so while that is getting created, what I've gone ahead and done is created one already prior to the session. So let's go and take a look at that. There are a couple of steps that you have to do still in order to make sure that the gateway is up and running. First step is to essentially click on that Create Gateway. In this case, the gateway is already created, and what you can see is that there are the connection between my office and the demo virtual network is not yet created. Because in order to create that connection, what I need to do is I need to configure my office VPN gateway before the connection is established, which obviously I have not done. And we won't do that in the interest of time. What we'll do is we will see how I can basically connect a client machine to that demo virtual network, right? There are a couple of steps that need to be done before you can do so. The first is you have to upload the client certificate. In this case, I've already uploaded a public certificate for the client, and you can do so by clicking here. So I have the demo VNet cert. That is my public key. I'm not going to go ahead and do it right now. It takes a couple of seconds in order for that to happen. The second thing you want to do is you want to download the VPN package. Essentially, that's a simple configuration script that configures my machine here so that it is ready to connect to demo VNet, right? So I'm going to do that. And once I actually run that executable on my machine, it's going to install a simple settings in my network options. And what that does is it is using the VPN client that's automatically built into the Windows operating system, right, to set up that connection. It's not like a new client is being downloaded. And once all of that is set up, if you actually see here on the right-hand side, a new option gets created in my networks, demo VNet, right? So that is the one that gets used. Now, if I were to click that and say connect, it is going to actually connect it to the virtual network that I just created. It's connecting. The step that I missed and did not show you was importing my private certificate into my certificate store, which I had done already. So that's a step that you want to do before you actually get this set up. Otherwise, it's going to complain and ask you to do that. Okay? So once it's connected, in this case it is, essentially what has happened now is you've gotten your private IP address from the range that we specified earlier. And what you can see is it has gotten a 10.0.0.3 address, right? So essentially what's happened is now this particular machine that I have here is connected to the demo VNet. And if I had a server running inside my demo VNet, they become, I can ping that server, I can share files on that server, and I can access that server from this machine using that IPsec tunnel. So again, this becomes a very interesting scenario for test and development. If I were on the road, I was a developer, and my administrator did not want me to log in using RDP because it's not secure, this is yet another way I can actually connect up to a test and dev environment in Windows Azure from perhaps an airport cafe using my Microsoft Surface Pro. So a pretty neat feature with virtual network point-to-site connectivity. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the other scenarios that are possible with Windows Azure, which is the last one. I want to quickly cover this in the interest of time. Essentially, this is a set of scenarios which you would think of using Windows Azure where your existing data center or infrastructure might not really fit the bill, right? Might not really fit the needs that you have. There are three sub-scenarios I want to talk about here. The first of which is a fairly common scenario of building global websites. If you talk to any enterprise today, shadow IT is a big problem. Why? Because the marketing guys in that particular enterprise are quickly spinning up websites or marketing campaigns using their credit cards, right? So it's a very, very popular scenario. And in Windows Azure, there are ready-made services for you to actually spin up websites fairly quickly using open frameworks like your Joomla or WordPress and so on. So there's a gallery of images that we provide, and you can spin up websites using those. And once you spin up those websites, what you can also do is use a service called Traffic Manager that allows for that website to be served out of the different data centers that we have in the world, and so that customers don't see the latency that's associated with that website running in just one data center, right? So it makes for building websites on a global scale, highly performing websites, a lot easier. Again, if you were running a data center and you had even big enterprises only tend to have data centers in a few regions around the world, not everywhere, this becomes a unique way in which you can use Windows Azure for. All right, a second way in where Windows Azure actually you can use is for basically mobile services. If you had an enterprise, you had a lot of intranet applications, and you wanted to build mobile apps for those internet applications, Windows Azure provides a turnkey backend for those applications. It has structured data, it has authentication mechanisms and push notifications. And all of those are in SDKs for Android, for iOS, and Windows Phone that you can quickly develop applications. So again, this makes for a very interesting scenario that you can consider Windows Azure for. Now, a third thing is for partner integration, right? A lot of the times when you are running big IT systems that you want to connect to your partners, be it your suppliers or your vendors, you have complicated billing systems that you want to connect. A lot of our customers are using Windows Azure for those sort of purposes because you need, for any of these connections to happen, essentially what you need is an integration system that's highly available and scalable. And Windows Azure provides that by default using services called Service Bus and even BizTalk services that we announced this morning, which has things like AAI capabilities and EDI capabilities. So if you want to connect things like SAP systems and Oracle EBS systems, all of the connections can happen with the integration services in Windows Azure. Right? So again, a good scenario to consider Windows Azure for. So essentially, these are the scenarios where we're seeing a lot of traction from customers who are getting their feet wet with Windows Azure. Of course, like you saw this morning at Keynote, a lot of customers like Trek have done fairly interesting things and complicated things with Windows Azure, and all of that is also possible. Right? So with that, what I want to now do is first of all, I want to point you to a bunch of other sessions that you can attend and learn some of these things in greater detail. Because the purpose of this session was to give you an idea of what Windows Azure is and simple things you can do with Windows Azure. But as you go deeper into the technologies, I would recommend these sessions very, very highly. And there's a call to action for those of you who have not yet played with Windows Azure. Just sign up for an account and start using it for the different things that I mentioned, and you'll realize how easy and simple it is to get started. And if you're an MSDN subscriber and you actually sign up for Windows Azure, there's a nice way you can win that fancy car there, right? So with that, let me open it out to questions. We have about 5 minutes for questions.
I have one question.
Sure, go ahead.
In order to better support separation of duties, do you guys actually do role-based access controls for the individual services within an Azure account? One of the issues that my security team has is that the individuals that own and manage the network components versus the load balancers versus the VMs are totally different teams, and they don't want any one person to be able to subvert any of our security policies. So do you guys actually support those, or are those on your roadmap for Azure?
So right now, we don't have that support for role-based access across the different services. That is something, however, we're considering with Windows Azure Active Directory and how we can provide that in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.